Brian, where were you born?
Within the Sound of Bow Bells in Stratford-atte-Bow, which is a district in West Ham in the dock areas of London, so I'm a true Cockney, I suppose.
What about your education? Where did it take place?
Well, I was educated in a normal elementary school, Godwin Road in West Ham, and then I went to West Ham Secondary School, then became an evacuee at the early part of the war and was educated for about 6 months up in Horncastle in Lincolnshire, and then eventually the school was evacuated down to Helston in Cornwall.
Let's talk about this evacuation, because I know you make some play of both these places in one of your autobiographies. Let's talk first about Lincolnshire.
Well, I spent a lot of my childhood holidays in Lincolnshire, quite close to where my mother was born. I used to go to Tattershall and Coningsby and Woodall Spa. And then when the school was evacuated down to Helston in Cornwall, I had a series of strange billets with foster parents until I eventually ended up in the vicarage at Porthleven with a remarkable couple called the Reverend Canon Gotto and his wife, who really, I suppose, were my surrogate parents and in many ways responsible really for forming my life. They really were a remarkable pair. They were well in their 60s when they took in 4 East End evacuees. They were childless themselves, and I forget what one got as a foster parent. It wasn't very much, about 8 bob a week, I believe. But he had a wonderful library, the vicar, and I suppose more than anything else, I had access to the library, and it was there, I suppose, that my character was really formed. And that's not to deride my own parents, but my parents were not rich in any way, and we didn't have books in the house. I mean, I used to go to West Ham Public Library, but we never bought books because we couldn't afford them. And to be suddenly given this sort of Alice in Wonderland great big library was, well, it opened my eyes to a totally different world. I did several school plays towards the end of the time I was at school, and this was, during the war, so unexpected to be called up anyway. And then as a result of thinking I was rather good on the stage, I don't know that I was, but I got a wonderful notice for playing Shylock, age 14, with I was wearing enough crepe hair to stuff a mattress. And I wrote to various people out of the Radio Times. I didn't know who else to write to, and 1 or 2 were good enough to reply to me, and in particular, the late Lionel Gamlin, who was a wonderful broadcaster, solemnly invited me to Bush House, which is where BBC Europe used to broadcast from during the war, and gave me an audition and said, well, if you're really serious, you must try for a scholarship at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art. And in fact, it was Lionel who was really responsible for my name, because in those days, and indeed today, your equity, British Actors Equity, don't let you have 2 actors with the same name. And there was a John Clark. There is a John Clark. I know him well now. He's married to Lynn Redgrave, and he was, at the time, quite a famous young child star playing William in the BBC series of Just William. And so over tea at the Aldwych Brasserie, I remember, Lionel Gamlin said, well, we better choose you a new name. Forbes is a good theatrical name, he said, Forbes Robertson. He wrote that down on the back of the menu, and then he said, now what would go with that? He said, what sounds good? Bryan. He said, Bryan sounds good. So you're Brian Forbes. And I went back and said to my amazed parents, oh, by the way, my name is now Brian Forbes. And to their eternal credit, they never turned a hair. It must have been amazing for them, really.
What about your contemporaries at RADA? Give us a few.
Well, I suppose there's one of my oldest friends, Norman Bird, who is an actor. We joined up on the same day. Pete Murray, the disc jockey, he was there. Alex McCowan, I suppose, was the most famous student of my era. I just missed Dickie Attenborough. He was there the term before me, and I thought, my God, that's how an actor should dress, because he had hush puppies and a camel hair coat. And hair in those days.
How came you then from there into the forces?
Well, I got call-up papers. they followed me around, actually. I was on tour with Flarepath, and I remember I got to, I forget where it was, one night at the stage door, there were two policemen there with the call-up papers, and that was that. They'd followed me around for 2 or 3 weeks, you know, because we were on tour a week at a time. And I was called up from there.
Where did you serve in the army?
All over the place. Egypt, Germany, Austria, France.
You stayed in fact, until 1948. Can I ask why? Was it simply that you couldn't get out before then, or was there some reason for it?
2 reasons. A, I was very young when I was called up, and I got a very high demob number. And B, I spoke German. And during the Army of Occupation, they wanted people to stay on who were able to speak German.
But 1948 then saw you back on the stage and back into films. How into films?
Well, I came straight out of the army, literally, got a demob suit, so I looked like the depressed area's Jimmy Cagney, which I immediately flogged to get some money. But Norman Bird and myself had made a pact when we joined up on the same day, and we decided we would both open a joint bank account, and we would save 10 shillings a week, which was not an inconsiderable sum, and whoever survived the war would get the lot, or if we both survived, we would share it. And when we came out, I think we had about 220 quid each, which sort of set me up because it was a small fortune. And I went straight out of the sort of demobilization centre into rehearsals of a play called Gathering Storm, which was a real turkey and opened and closed within hours in a snowstorm. But a man who was then the casting director for the Rank organisation, called Dennis Van Towle, happened to catch one of the few performances, and I got a contract at Pinewood with the Rank organisation. It was really just coming up to the first demise of the British film industry, but I mean, I had 3 good years when I went from film to film, always playing cowards, and they still turn up on television, of course, and my daughters used to say, "Daddy, you look so young." And I used to say,
When you were.
well, I was young, yes. It's funny to see them. I saw one the other day. I'd even forgotten I'd made it, and it turned up in black and white. There I was with a shock of black hair and looking about 3, I thought, because I was always stuck with a sort of, young Woodley face.
Let's look at the first visit to America then. I know that when you went, or I believe that when you went, you were about broke.
Well, I was broke, yes. I arrived in Hollywood, I think, with no money at all. But I had some good friends out there, notably Jimmy Granger, who was then married to Gene Simmons, and Liz Taylor and Mike Wilding and that. I used to do Jimmy Granger's fan mail for him, and he used to pay me for that. And then I got a contract at Universal Studios as an actor with a wonderful old director called Raoul Walsh, who remained a friend all his life and a very good friend to me. And I also, at the same time, had written by then, or had published a collection of short stories, and this was picked up by Cubby Broccoli of James Bond fame, and he gave me a commission to write a screenplay. It never saw the light of day, but I did get paid for it, I think $75. And I suppose my 2 careers then went hand in hand, really, writing, and I'd always been a writer. I'd published some pretty turgid stuff when I was about 16, but the short stories I was quite proud of, which were published post-war, and from that I got really my first big screen credit, which it was a film called Cockleshell Heroes, which Jose Ferrer and Trevor Howard did.
Mm-hmm. Before we, I don't want to talk too much about other people, but I know that you met, and in apostrophe commas, knew to some extent Howard Hughes.
Well, I did. It was extraordinary because people who lived in Hollywood for hundreds of years never met him, but at that time Gene Simmons was under contract to him. Gene was making Androcles and the Lion for him, and he used to come up to Jimmy Granger's house every night with henchmen and sit there. And I always remember he would never open the toilet door. He would have somebody open it, and Jimmy Granger shouted out at him, "Well, you're not going to catch anything from my toilet." But he was pathological, as you know, about certain things, and he would not touch anything. So I suppose, yes, I was one of the few people of my generation who ever clapped eyes on him, because certain people who had been under contract, employed by him for years, never met him.
Is there an easy way in which one can answer the question, what was he like?
No, I don't think there is, and I wouldn't pretend an
Mm.
intimacy which I didn't have. I mean, obviously, he was a very charismatic and at the same time very enigmatic character. Um, no, I mean, I really couldn't venture an opinion.
Your stay in Hollywood ended, in actual fact, due largely to kindness from Raoul Walsh in a roundabout sort of a way.
Yes, I think it's true to say that in a sense, Raoul really saved my life. I had a very unfortunate and distressing first marriage, which ended out there, and I was broke. And he gave me a ticket home. Um, in fact, put me on the plane. You know, I mean, when he found out the circumstances, said, "Well, don't stay here. You'll become a bum or a drunk. Get out of town." And I said to him, "Well, how will I ever repay you?" And he said, "Well, we'll meet up." And indeed, we did meet up about a year later when he came to London and shanghaied me into another film.
There was, I think, a delay in New York.
With Gertie Lawrence. I stayed with Gertie, yes. You've done your homework and read my autobiography. Yes, Gertie Lawrence I stayed with because I had been in the last play she ever did in this country called September Tide, Daphne du Maurier's play, which was at the Aldwych, and I played her son. And she was a remarkable, very funny lady and very dear lady, and I think possibly, you know, the word star is terribly overworked, but my definition of a star is somebody who puts bums on seats and sells tickets. Certainly there was never a seat to be had during the 9 months we played September Tide. And the moment she walked on the stage, I mean, you knew you were in the presence of somebody rather special. I don't think she was a great actress, but she was a great personality, and she was a great theatrical personality. An example of Gertie's kindness to me, anyway, was while we were on tour in Manchester before we came into London. The play, as originally rehearsed, I had to bring the curtain down with Gertie, singing. We sang together, "Anything You Can Do, I Can Do Better." And for some reason, I think it was Emil Litlow, had Annie Get Your Gun running at the Coliseum at that time. He surprisingly refused permission to let us use it. And so between the matinee and the evening performance at Manchester, Gertie and I went out to try and find a song that was in public domain. And we found an old song of Whispering Jack Smith's called "Who's Wonderful, Who's Marvelous, Miss Annabel Lee." And we put that in between the matinee and the evening performance, but we rehearsed it with the iron curtain down. And I thought I was singing like Pavarotti. But when the curtain went up, there's this tiny, squeaky voice which completely bitched the whole end of the play. And there was a tremendous row afterwards with the producer and that, and I sort of slunk away. And I heard Gertie say, "And the kid ruined the last act. I didn't come 3,000 miles to die the death in Manchester." So I went back to my depressing digs and thought, well, that's the end of my career. I'll get the notice. And I was sort of commiserating with myself, having a glass of beer. It must have been about 1 o'clock in the morning when the telephone rang. And I picked it up, and a voice said, "Can I speak to Brian Forbes?" And I said, "Speaking." This voice said, "What are you doing up at this time of night? This is Miss Lawrence." And I said, "Well, I'm feeling fairly depressed at having mucked the end of the play up for you." And she said, "Oh, that's nothing. I just sounded off." She said, "Come and have breakfast with me tomorrow morning." And she took me out and gave me oysters, which I'd never had, and bought me a scarf, I remember. I mean, I would have been grateful if she'd just said hello to me when I went into the theatre the following night, but she went, you know, took the trouble to ring at 1 o'clock in the morning because she knew, obviously, that I was blowing my brains out.
Mm-hmm.
That was Gertie Lawrence.
Okay, so you arrived back after the stay in New York then with Miss Lawrence. What to next?
Well, I suppose I've always been very fortunate in my friends, and I came back really to nothing because I'd sold my... I had a small house in Hampstead. It sounds very grand, but it wasn't. I shared it with Peter Brook. But I'd sold my share and my car and everything raise the airfare to get to Hollywood. So I came back to nothing, but again, I had a marvellous friend, a man who remained my friend until the end of his life. He was my publisher too. He was a marvellous editor, lovely man called Roger Machell. And I also met him in New York and explained my predicament. And he said, well, I'm going to be over here for 3 months. You can use my flat. And his flat was in Albany, Piccadilly, and you don't get better addresses than that.
No.
So I found myself ensconced in Albany, Piccadilly, in B1, under J.B. Priestley, and opposite me was Dame Edith Evans, and that's how I first got to know Edith, by living in the Albany.
I want to come to Dame Edith Evans later a little, if I may, but first of all, it has to be said that when you mention the name Brian Forbes, the next breath is Nanette Newman. You mention the name Nanette Newman, and the next breath is Brian Forbes. So let's talk about you meeting your wife, and let's talk about this electronic association that you seem to have.
I met her in Marylebone shunting yards very late on a February night when I was making a B picture called Wheel of Fate, rather coincidentally. And it was the last shot of the last day of the film. And I was meant to commit suicide under a real train because it was a very cheap film and I didn't have a stunt double. And I came out from a rehearsal hoping I would actually survive the actual take because I had to throw myself on a cowcatcher as the train came towards me. And there was this, I thought, ravishing young lady standing under the lamppost by my chair, and I went over and chatted her up and said, oh, have you come to see the filming? And she called me sir and said, no, sir, no, Mr. Forbes, there's a chance I might be in your film playing the secretary. Well, I knew the part of the secretary had been cast and finished 3 weeks previously, so I knew she was in for quite a tricky evening with the producer. So I sort of explained this to her as gently as I could and said, I think you should go and sit in my car and I'll drive you home. And that was the beginning of a lifelong romance, as they say.
Mm-hmm.
That's how it all began. And I've been married long enough to have a 28-year-old daughter, and women don't like to talk about ages. Dame Edith, she said, counting the years is a sign of deterioration.
Let's talk, if we may, about your first association with Sir Richard Attenborough, and perhaps progress it through to the association of the two of you then with Basil Dearden and Jack Hawkins.
Yes, I'd known Dickie, as I say, ever since RADA, but we hadn't worked together until we found ourselves on a plane going to Malta to make a film called The Baby and the Battleship, which I was responsible for writing and directed by a very talented man who alas died too young, called J. Lewis. He also made Morning Departure, and he was a real good filmmaker and a good friend. And Dickie and I found ourselves sharing a bedroom, I think, in Rome and in Malta. And from that came a very, well, one of the great influences, I think, in both our lives, because we eventually became such close friends that we were both actors, basically, but we thought, well, we can't do any worse than some of the people we work for. Why don't we form our own production company? So we performed as Beaver Films, a name, I think, chosen by our wives, because she said, both of them said, well, you both work like beavers, you better call yourself Beaver. And the first film we made was The Angry Silence, which after many a trial and tribulation proved a very, I suppose, a watershed film in many ways in terms of the British film industry. We mortgaged ourselves, put ourselves in hock to make it. In fact, we made it virtually for nothing. And then from that came another association, which you've mentioned, with the late Basil Dearden. Everybody seems to be the late somebody, and I suppose all one's friends do fall off the perch as one gets older oneself. Jack Hawkins, too, and Basil's partner, Michael Relf, who's still with us, and another director called Guy Green. We formed a company called Allied Filmmakers. And that got off to a flying start with also a film which I wrote called The League of Gentlemen. And from that we made other films such as Whistle Down the Wind, which was the first film I directed. And that curiously owed a great deal to my childhood days in Lincolnshire, because the film, if people remember it, opens with 3 children following a man who is about to drown some kittens in a gravel pit. And that's an episode from my own childhood which was burnt into my memory. And I remember including it in the screenplay because it had such an effect on me that anybody would drown kittens. I suppose farmers have a different attitude towards animals because they make their living by them, and city people tend to sort of be much more sentimental, although I wouldn't in any way suggest that anybody should drown kittens or at Christmas throw puppies out on the motorway. It seems to be the most disgusting behaviour. So Allied filmmakers, we went on to make other films like Seance and A Wet Afternoon, and Basil made a remarkably advanced film called Victim, which was the first film that ever treated the theme of homosexuality in any serious way.
It seems to me that you were supremely qualified perhaps to talk to some extent about Jack Hawkins. Would you like to do that?
Yes, well, of course, Jack was somebody who, as an actor, I greatly admired because he sort of epitomised, in my opinion, the best of British film actors. I mean, few people, I think, will forget some of his performances, such as The Cruel Sea. And it was during the making of The League of Gentlemen that, alas, he became aware of the seriousness of his condition. I remember we stopped shooting for about 3 days because his voice was so bad, and I think it was then that he went away and was told that he had cancer of the throat. And he's an incredibly brave man, as you know, because it was really his bravery that killed him in the end. He mastered this technique of speaking on a breath. It used to frustrate him, but he got by for many years, and then I think he suddenly thought, oh, sod it, I can't go on with this any longer, and he went to have another operation, which in fact was successful. I remember Michael Wilding went to see him in hospital and said for a moment the wonderful voice was back, and it wasn't that killed him. It was a fact that I think he'd had so much radium treatment that the actual arteries couldn't be stopped, and he in fact died through loss of blood subsequent to the operation. Very brave man, Jack, dear man.
1964, Hollywood called again.
That's right, yes. I went back to make King Rat, the first film I ever directed in Hollywood. And that was quite a pleasant experience because I left Hollywood really with the status of a road sweeper in 1952 or whenever it was, and to go back and be directing a major motion picture was quite satisfying, I suppose, because Hollywood's not a place to be a failure in. It's a great place to be a success in. Don't be a failure there because your phone never rings.
Did you pay back that debt?
The debt to Raoul Walsh, yes, I did. I always wanted to pay him back in his own currency, so during the making of the film, because he helped me with regard to putting together an American crew. He chose a very good first assistant for me called Russ Saunders, I remember. And during the shooting of the film, I went to dinner with him, and during dinner gave him an envelope, and he said, "What's that?" And I said, "It's some money I owe you." I think it was about $447.
The legendary Dame Edith Evans.
Yes, well, I made the documentary because when she was really of quite an advanced age, 84, she suffered a stroke. And Edith was a Christian Scientist, and she refused all medical aid until she literally went into a coma. And there was a local doctor down in Kent where she lived who, true to his own oath, had to take her into hospital, although she wasn't aware. And apparently when she was in this cottage hospital, she called for me, asked for me, and I drove through the night and got there, and fully expected her to either be dead or with very few hours to live. And as I drove up, I suppose I got there about 6 in the morning, I got in, there was a real dragon of a matron who said, well, you can't go and see her. She's on a drip feed, and until the surgeon arrives, no one's allowed to see her. And I said, well, she's asked for me, and I haven't come all this way to be turned away at the door, but I'll go away and have some breakfast, and I'll come back. And I came back about an hour later, and the dragon had disappeared. And as I drove up, it was a cottage hospital. I parked the car and I heard her voice, which was unmistakable. And so I just walked into the hospital and found the room, and there she was, poor darling, looking like Marley's ghost and obviously very ill. And she was very pleased to see me and sat up in bed and said, "Bry," she always called me Bry for some reason, "give me a mirror." So I got a mirror for her and she looked at it and she said, "They all think I'm going to go, you know," she said, "but I'm not going to go looking like that." She said, "I want lamb chops and peas for lunch." So I found a sister and I said, "She wants lamb chops and peas for lunch." And the sister said, "No, impossible." She said, "She's on a drip feed and can't possibly have any solids." And I said, "I don't think you understand who that lady is." I said, "That's Dame Edith Evans. She may well be dying, and if she's dying, if I have to kill a sheep with my bare hands, she's going to have lamb chops for lunch." And we got her lamb chops, and she lived another 4 years. And it was during that time when she felt she could never go back to the stage, and really I think was very depressed and a rather lonely woman. I think really in the last decade of her life I was possibly the most regular visitor she ever saw. I used to see her at least twice a month. I used to drive down there. So I said to her, "Look, why don't we make a film about your life? And I'll bring the boys down, a crew, and, you know, we'll come down every 3 weeks, shall we say, and do a day so we don't tire you out." And in a way, I think it gave her something to live for. And it was an exploration not only for me, but really for herself. And it was during one of those visits that I found a box of love letters from her husband. And very few people knew that Dame Edith had ever been married, and she had the most poignant and really tragic marriage. When she was a little milliner, prior to the First World War, she fell in love with a clerk who used to work at Woollands, which was a big drapery store in Knightsbridge. It's now Harvey and Nichols. And he was called up in the war, fought in the trenches, and by the time he came back, she was a star, and he felt he couldn't support her lifestyle, so he did the sort of time-honored thing. He went to Venezuela as an oil prospector and did rather well, and they corresponded for 17 years, and he came back after 17 years, and they married, and were blissfully happy for about 3 or 4 years, and he suddenly died of a brain tumor, and she never married again, never had any children, and I found all his love letters, all tied up in a box, which she had literally not seen or not allowed herself to see for about 35 years. And I remember showing them to her on film, and she said the most touching thing about them. She said, I never knew, one forgets, you know, I never knew he loved me so much. In many ways, she gave her whole life to the theatre. I mean, she absolutely dedicated herself to the theatre. She was a very lonely woman. Wonderful woman. I think one of the most remarkable women I've ever met. I think I've been extraordinarily lucky, as I said before, in my, not choice of friends, because one doesn't choose friends. Friends kind of gravitate to you. Mm-hmm. But I've known some really remarkable women, and I would include my wife. But I've known Kate Hepburn, I've known Betty Davis, and I've known, through Dame Edith, another remarkable woman called Enid Bagnold, who was Lady Jones. She was married to Sir Roderick Jones, the man who ran Reuters, and Edith did a lot of her plays. So when I was writing Edith's biography, I went to see Enid, and she was truly, I think, a really remarkable woman. Kate Hepburn, obviously, very remarkable. Betty Davis, remarkable. It's very curious, but if you have good friends, I think, you know, that it really sort of fulfills one's life.
1968 in Elstree.
You say it so boldly. 1968, he says, Elstree, triggering me off. Yes, well, right out of the blue, Bernard Delfont asked me to run the studio and become managing director of Elstree in those days. And in many ways it was the most rewarding and at the same time probably the most distressing period of my life, because post the event I was accused of having too much power, and in fact I didn't have enough. And I'm not very good really at the power game, I suppose. I was much more interested not in the power politics, but in running a studio which could make some good films and possibly revitalise the British film industry. Unfortunately, those who employed me really didn't have the courage of my convictions, and I was starved of the necessary funds. And in the end, I resigned simply because I could see no other way out. I was sort of boxed into a situation which was intolerable. But I don't regret it. As I say, it was in many ways one of the most interesting periods of my life. And I think we achieved something. We made some very good films which still live on. I mean, I'm very proud of the fact that I made The Go-Between and The Railway Children with Lionel Jeffries and Tales of Beatrix Potter, and my own film which I made during that period, which was The Raging Moon, with Malcolm McDowell and Nanette. And it was a kind of finger up to a few people when Nanette won the Best Actress for that, because I was heavily criticised for casting her. I never understood that attitude in England, that you're not supposed to sort of work with your own wife as if it's somehow that she's got the plague. Or
Are you able to tell us, you are the best person to tell us the anecdote about, I think, when someone asked Mrs. Forbes how she got the part. What was the reply?
Oh, I think it was Walter Winchell when we were over in New York promoting The Wrong Box, which Nanette was also very successful in. And it was in the days, it was steam radio, and they were very sort of prudish in those days. And Winchell came up with the inevitable question, how did you get this role, Mrs. Forbes? And Nanette, who had had him by then, I think, said, I slept with the director. And they pressed all the censor keys and went off the air, I think. When you've been married a long time, there are certain questions which come up with such unfailing regularity that sometimes during interviews you think to yourself, how can I possibly give any new slant or nuance to such a question? And I suppose it's something of an oddity for people to stay married as long as Nanette and I have, and to be still as happy as a few years ago. In many ways, I wouldn't be what I am, I wouldn't have got where I am without her. There's no doubt she has been the most tremendous influence on my life. I don't think I would have any direction in my life if I wasn't married to her, and I didn't have two daughters as I do.
Well, the position now is this. If at the end of this interview you consider that I've been sufficiently kind to you, then I'm going to ask you whether you will arrange for me sometime to interview your wife, but that later on. Let's talk about France and Sunday Lovers.
Oh, that was a funny little episodic film. Really came about because a friend, Leslie Brickus, who'd written it, asked me to direct it, and Roger Moore was going to be in it, and Denham Elliott, and Lynn Redgrave, and a young lady who has since gone on to make a considerable success in the American miniseries. And it just seemed like a fun thing to do. It was only 3 weeks, and we shot it all in a chateau in outside Bordeaux. I never saw the film because what is known as died the death. It was on and off in about 4 days, so I don't know really what it was like. I never saw it. It had 4 directors, you see, in 4 different episodes, and I think at one point one of the directors, who should be nameless, turned in a rather bad episode, and as a result the film didn't do very well.
You moved, whichever way you choose, either up or down the scale in 1984 and became again an actor.
Oh, yes, so I did. I thought, for one terrible moment, I couldn't think what you were going to ask me. Yes, suddenly out of the blue, Granada, or Stephen Frears at Granada Television rang me and said, would you like to do December Flower, a film called December Flower? And I thought he was asking me to direct it. So I said, well, yes, it sounds very interesting. What's it about? And I gradually became aware that he was asking me to act in it. And I said, are you sure you're ringing the right person? I haven't acted for 22 years. And he said, oh, yes. It's to play opposite Gene Simmons. Well, since, like most of my generation, I'd been in love with Gene Simmons, when I was about 17 or 18, I leapt at the chance, and she's an old friend, and off I went to Manchester and did that. And about 6 months later, they asked me to act again in the Geoffrey Archer serial, what is it? First Amongst Equals.
Mm-hmm. And How came then this change in direction towards writing a miniseries on Henry Ford?
Well, again, it never saw the light of day. I mean, a man called Dick Cusack, who lives in Chicago, rang me literally out of the blue and said, would I be interested in doing it? And I went over to see him and got sort of embroiled in the subject. I worked on it. I did an enormous amount of research at the Ford Foundation in Detroit and wrote this mammoth opus. And just when we were poised to begin shooting, I was going to direct it as well, we were pipped at the post. They did a really, though I say it myself, a rather sort of, well, it was Henry Ford out of Dallas, I think, really. They shot it and pipped us to the post. They made a rather sort of bastardized version and totally historically incorrect version, which I've seen. And so my script never saw the light of day, but it was an interest. Again, you see, nothing is really lost, I think. It introduced me to Chicago, and then I went back to Chicago for 26 weeks to make another film with Roger Moore and Rod Steiger called The Naked Face. And I love Chicago. I've been back there many times. Wonderful city. So I suppose if this man Cusack hadn't asked me to do Henry Ford, I'd never have got to Chicago in the first place.
Right. We take on board the directing, the acting, the writing, the people you've met, the places you've been. How do you still find things to do with any interest, for goodness sake?
Well, I think anybody who follows an artistic career has one great advantage. I mean, if you're lucky enough to be able to pursue something you want to do, and it isn't in the ordinary sense of the word a back-breaking, mind-bending 9 till 5 until you get the gold watch and the testimonial dinner. I'm very lucky that I've always had two strings to my bow, because being purely an actor, one can easily starve. But I've been fortunate that I've always been able to write from a very early age. I've been writing. I don't know, I've written 70 or 80 screenplays. So one always has to pay the gas bill. I had a young family to bring up. Nanette sacrificed her own career for about 4 years until the children were old enough. How do I find things? Well, there's always something around the corner, I think, and there's always something beyond the evidence. I think I've been very lucky in doing what I wanted to do and being able, with a few or more than a few failures along the road, because you can't just ride on success all your life. I mean, I think the failures are very necessary because they teach you a lot, and providing you don't go under, but have the ability to bounce back. And I suppose being a Cockney like Mike Caine, he and I are very similar in that I noticed in an article Mike wrote a couple of weeks ago in the Sunday Colour Supplement, he was talking about for 20 years I was hopeful, and for 10 years I was a failure, and for the last 20 I've been a success. I think Cockneys do have a kind of bounce back capability, and I think I inherited a lot of chutzpah, as the Jews say, from my mother, and I've been fortunate. I've been fortunate in my marriage, and I've been fortunate in that such talents as I possess, I've been able to put to some use.
Okay, then on the basis of what you've told us thus far, what's left undone?
He thought, checking his flies. That's what actors do before they go on stage, always check your flies. What's left undone? Well, I want to write more books. I'd like to write at least another 5 novels. If I ever won the pools, I would like to really landscape this garden. I've always wanted a water garden, but I've never had the bread to do it with. You need to win the pools, I think, to do it. I don't know, really. I think I've said it all. I'd like to go on directing until I'm a bit too old and can't say action. Nothing, really. I mean, if I died tomorrow, I would have had a very happy life.
Whether you've said it all or not, you certainly appear to have done it all. Let's, as it were, come a little closer to home, make it a bit more personal. Tell us first about your family.
Well, as I say, I've got 2 very gorgeous daughters who have both never really given me a moment's pain. They've given us some heartaches, but you expect that. They're both married. Sarah, the eldest one, is married to a very, very good, fine actor and a friend of mine called John Standing, who I'm sure your listeners will remember from many of the performances he's given. And Emma got married about 18 months ago to an extremely nice young man who is a banker. It's nice to have a banker in the family, although he won't handle my accounts. Wise man. They're both very talented in their own way. I hope that one of these days when her own children get older, Sarah will go back to writing because she's extremely talented. And when she was 17, and nothing to do with me, she had a book of poetry published, which I thought was quite remarkable. But she hasn't written much since. She did some journalism. Emma also, I always thought would be the actress in the family because like most parents, you go along to see the school plays and you think, oh, hope I won't be embarrassed. And I know she didn't say anything to us, but she was playing the lead in My Fair Lady, and we went along to the school, and I was totally astounded. On came this very shy character that I knew at home and belted out a number like, you know, a good old trooper. But she didn't. She wanted to become a ballet dancer, and she was very good at it. But unfortunately, when she was about 14, she broke her right leg very severely, a spiral fracture. And when she recovered from that, she was in plaster for well over 6 months. She could no longer do classical ballet because the leg wouldn't support her. And so she gave that up. She edited a magazine. She's now holding down a very high-powered PR job. She's PR for Ralph Lauren, which is, you know, a wonderful designer. Sarah at the moment is in Hollywood with John, where he's working. They have 2 grandchildren. The first boy in the family, in the whole family, since I was born, because we seem to produce nothing but girls right down the line. She has 2 children, a boy and a girl, aged 2 and 3. They live in Westwood at the moment. So this Christmas, for about the first time in well over 30 years, we're not all together, which is kind of sad. And my dear old dad died this time last year. In fact, I'd gone out to Hollywood to spend Christmas with Sarah and John. We'd all gone out there. And I'd only been there 44 hours, and my father died, and I had to get back on the plane and come and bury him. But he was a remarkable old chap and lived to be 94. We're all long livers. My mother was 94. Her mother was 98. His mother was 100. So maybe...
You can go back to Trafalgar in about 3 generations.
Yes, my father must have lived through, what, five reigns? He was born in Victoria's time and died in Queen Elizabeth II. He was a remarkable man, my father, in many ways. A disappointed man. I think he had to leave school and earn his living when he was about 11. And so he always felt that he was... Robbed, yes. Because he had a good intelligence, but he could never sometimes apply it. It was very frustrating.
Do you have time for, I don't know, hobbies, recreations? It seems to me not. I don't know.
Yes, I run a bookshop. I have done for 22 years locally here in the village. I usually go and serve in there on Saturdays. If I wasn't doing this interview, I'd be serving there this afternoon, and any excuse to get away from my word processor and the new novel I'm working on.
Aren't they dreadful, word processors?
No, they've saved my life.
Oh, can't be doing with them. Can't be doing with them. Don't understand them.
Oh, they're marvellous, I think. I mean, it's changed my life. I used to bend over a hot typewriter until I had to go to the osteopath. No, I serve in the bookshop, which I enjoy because I've always been passionate about books. As you can see from this room, there's hardly an inch where there isn't a book. Nanette says, why don't I bookshelf the B-Day? We're sort of running out of space, and as you see, they're piling up now on this table as well. But I used to buy so many books, I thought, why not have a bookshop?
Why not?
You asked me about hobbies. Well, I'm a kind of, my friends ironically call me Capability Forbes because I'm a sort of frustrated gardener. as I said earlier, I'd love to landscape. One needs a lot of money to run a garden, and nature's very cruel. I mean, in the October hurricane, I lost 42 enormous trees, and I've replanted a lot, but of course I'll never see them. I won't live that long. Other hobbies, I don't know, seeing friends. I had a period when I was passionate about stamp collecting, and did that for about 3 years. I always think hell for leather. If I take something up, I've got to do it to the exclusion of everything else, and then I'll probably drop it again. But I've never lost my love of books, and we entertain at home. We don't go out a lot, and I hate, like Nanette, I hate cocktail parties. I hate sort of planned parties when you stand on one leg and try and balance the drink and some hideous curled sandwich and talk to a lot of people you never want to meet. I hate that. So we avoid that.
Probably a very wise move, I think. Incidentally, over the apropos of the gardening,
Yes.
ring Donald Sinden. He'll look after your garden. He adores gardens and he adores doing other people's, particularly hedges, I'm told.
Really?
Yes.
Well, I haven't got any hedges, but I've got a lot of...
Well, ring Donald Sinden. He'll look after your garden for you. Finally, then, if you were to be robbed of every memory that you had, bar one, and were to be only allowed to keep that one, you tell us what it would be.
Oh, this is the trick question, isn't it? This is Desert Island Discs with a vengeance, almost. An impossible question to answer, of course.
No, it isn't.
Well, it is, because you might have... obviously, it would have to be a happy memory, I would say. And I've had many. I suppose, and you put me on the spot, so I haven't really given it a great deal of thought, but I suppose when Emma was born, Nanette had to have a cesarean. And with a cesarean, you know the exact moment when your child is going to be born. And I remember she had to go in at 8 o'clock, and I was pacing the room in the hospital, in Queen Charlotte's Hospital, and she'd left a note by the bedside, which was really a goodbye note, saying, if I don't come through the operation, this is what. And so I suppose the happiest memory I would have is when she came up from the operating theatre and she was alive and the baby was alive.